Elvis Presley walked out of the studio mid-session not in anger but in defiance, and what he said before leaving silenced an entire industry. Elvis Presley had just left the studio, and the silence he left behind felt heavy, almost like a loud bang. No one moved or spoke, they were all stunned. His guitar case was still slightly shaking on the chair where he had angrily dropped it. Just before walking out, he had said something so strong and honest that it would go on to be remembered in music history. It all happened so fast. One minute, Elvis was calmly playing his old guitar like he'd done many times before. The next, he stood up, looking straight at the music executives who had just told him that his new song wasn't good for business. Then, in a calm and clear voice, he delivered a line that no one would ever forget. "I'd rather be a has-been who stood for something than a star who stood for nothing." And with that, he was gone. It was March the 15th, 1968, Arce Studio B in Nashville. What was supposed to be a normal afternoon recording session turned into one of the most defiant moments of Elvis Presley's life. A room full of executives, marketing analysts, and industry gatekeepers had tried to control the king of rock and roll, and they failed. What led to that moment, that quiet storm of rebellion, wasn't a sudden outburst. It was years of pressure, compromise, and frustration boiling under the surface. But this time, Elvis didn't swallow it. He didn't nod and go along. He stood up and he walked out. But to understand why it happened and why that line still hits like thunder today, we need to rewind just a few hours, back to the start of the day, before the tension, before the clash, before the storm broke loose. Because this wasn't just a recording session, it was a showdown between the artist Elvis was and the product they wanted him to become. It all started off like any other studio session. The musicians were tuning their instruments. The sound engineers were adjusting mics. The coffee in the break room was already cold. Elvis walked in quietly, dressed casual jeans, a jacket, and that signature look of intensity behind his eyes. He wasn't here to play the part of a celebrity. He was here to make music. Studio B felt familiar. He'd recorded here before, surrounded by people who had shared his journey from the beginning. Scotty Moore, DJ Fontana, the Jordanaires in the corner. It was meant to be a return to roots, a space to create, a space to breathe. And this wasn't just any album. It was his comeback, a real one, not just another movie soundtrack or made-for radio collection of hits. He was ready to dig deeper, to write something personal, something that mattered. That's when he pulled out the song, a handwritten piece called Searching for Something Real. It was raw, honest. He talked about his time in the army, the emptiness that followed fame, the loneliness of being worshipped by millions but truly understood by none. He strummed a few chords, the room fell quiet, the musicians listened. But behind the glass in the control room, something else was happening. Suits and crisp blazers were already glancing at charts. Colonel Tom Parker was whispering to a young executive. Eyes rolled. Notes were passed. Elvis hadn't even sung the chorus, and already the feedback was forming, cold, clinical, and calculated. When the song ended, there was a pause. Not the kind of pause that comes from awe, but from discomfort. Then a voice crackled through the speakers, cheerful, fake, and heavy with judgment. "Elvis, baby, we need to talk about that song." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. The room got colder. The walls felt tighter. What had started as a comeback session was quickly turning into something else. They didn't want Elvis the artist. They wanted Elvis the product, and he felt it in his bones. Elvis stayed seated, his guitar still resting across his knees. He looked up toward the control room, his eyes locked on the speaker overhead, like he was expecting the worst. And sure enough, it came. Harold Morrison, RK's senior and raw executive, cleared his throat and tried to sugarcoat the blow. "Elvis, it's just, this song is a little too introspective, too serious. It's not really what your fans expect from you. We've got radio play to consider, charts to think about." Elvis didn't say a word. He just sat there, eyes narrowing slightly as the words piled on, one after another, like carefully packaged insults wrapped in concern. Another executive chimed in, pretending to sound helpful. "Your audience wants fun, something they can dance to. This song's more heavy, kind of spiritual, right?" He wasn't wrong. The song was heavy. That was the point. It wasn't meant for toe, tapping, or jukeboxes. It was a window into Elvis's soul, a cry for something beyond the lights, the money, the fame, something real, something that actually meant something. Now they wanted to kill it. Colonel Parker leaned into the mic, adding his voice to the growing wall of polite rejection. We're all on the same team here, son. We just want what's best for your career. Why rock the boat? That last line hit hard. Because that's exactly what Elvis wanted to do. Rock the damn boat. Tip it over if he had to. He hadn't come all this way just to be told how to feel, what to say, or which songs were safe. Around him, the studio felt like it was shrinking. The band looked uneasy. Even the Jordanaires avoided eye contact. Scotty Moore gave a half shrug, like he wanted to support Elvis, but didn't know if he should speak up. Elvis took a breath, slow and deep. He looked through the glass, past the suits, past the charts and graphs, and finally spoke, not with rage, but with something sharper. Disappointment. When did you become an expert on what my fans want? Have you read the letters I get? Do you see their eyes when I sing something real? The room went still. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the clouds were forming. The silence that followed his words stretched long and uncomfortable. Elvis leaned back slightly, running his thumb along the edge of his guitar. You could almost hear his heart pounding, not with nerves, but with restrained frustration. Then it happened, a soft laugh. It came from the control room, faint, but sharp enough to cut through the tension like glass. Elvis froze. Slowly, his eyes drifted toward the source, Bradley Winchester. A young executive, freshly promoted, polished suit, perfect hair, the kind of guy who probably had never written a song in his life, but somehow had opinions about all of them. The kind of guy who thought music was just a product and artists were just employees. He chuckled again, leaned in toward another executive, and whispered something. They both smiled. That laugh, that single smug sound was the last straw. Elvis set his guitar down gently, too gently, like he didn't trust himself to move quickly. Then he stood up, one slow movement at a time, his body calm, but his eyes, not anymore. He walked toward the window dividing the studio from the control room. Every step was deliberate. You could hear the floor creak under his boots. No one dared say a word. Even Colonel Parker leaned back in his chair. Elvis stopped just a few feet from the glass. And then with a calm intensity that was more powerful than any shout, he said, "You've forgotten what music is supposed to be." Nobody moved. You've turned it into a product, something you sell like cereal or soap, but that's not what it is. Music is truth. It's a soul pouring itself into sound. It's joy, pain, fear, love, raw, messy, beautiful. Behind the glass, the suits shifted in their seats. One looked down, another clicked his pen nervously. Even the smug smile on Winchester's face began to fade. Elvis wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His voice was steady, clear, and cutting. When you make it safe and easy to sell, you kill the very thing that makes it matter. The control room went silent. Elvis had drawn a line, not just in the session, but in the industry, and everyone knew. The storm had finally arrived. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence. The kind that doesn't just fill a room, it presses down on it. Then Elvis spoke. He didn't look at any one person. He looked at all of them. His voice was clear, firm, but it didn't sound like anger anymore. It sounded like something deeper, like truth finally finding the strength to speak after being buried too long. "I didn't start singing to make suits happy," he said. "I got into music because it was the only thing that made sense in a world that didn't." He stepped closer to the glass. When I first walked into Sun Studio in '54, nobody told me what to sound like. Nobody told me what would chart or what would sell. I just sang and it came from somewhere real. His hands were clenched, but his tone stayed steady. Somewhere along the way, this whole thing turned into a business meeting. Songs became units, fans became data, and I became a brand. The words hung in the air like smoke. You want me to be predictable, to be safe, to smile and nod and crank out records that don't say anything. You want me to be a jukebox in a tuxedo. Behind the glass, no one argued. No one could. But that's not music. That's noise with a paycheck attached. He paused again. His voice softened, but somehow hit harder. Music is the sound of someone trying to make sense of pain or joy, or heartbreak, or faith. And if you sanitize it, if you make it convenient, you kill it. The air in the studio was still. Even the equipment buzz seemed quieter. I've played along for years. I've nodded. I've let it slide. I told myself it was just part of the game. But sitting here, watching you laugh at something that came from my soul, I realized something. He looked directly at Winchester. My career isn't worth keeping if it means losing who I am. And just like that, the anger returned. But this time it wasn't wild, it was controlled, like fire in a furnace. So from here on out, I'm recording what I want, and I'm doing it my way, even if it costs me every last dime. And that was the moment. Elvis wasn't just defending a song, he was reclaiming his voice. No one moved, not a single breath broke the tension. The studio, the control room, even the faint hum of the recording gear seemed to fall silent under the weight of what had just been said. Elvis let the silence stretch. He wanted it to sit with them, to sting. Then he turned away from the glass. He walked slowly back to his guitar, the same worn Martin that had followed him through nearly every chapter of his life. Gently, almost reverently, he picked it up and slid it into its case. He didn't rush. Every movement was calm, intentional. Like he was closing a door he knew might never open the same way again. The musicians just watched, some in awe, some in disbelief. Others, especially the younger players, were trying not to smile because deep down they got it. They understood exactly what he had just done. Part of them wished they had the guts to do the same. Elvis looked up at them one last time. To the musicians in this room, he said, his voice low but clear, don't ever let them take your fire. Don't let them convince you that success matters more than truth. Then he looked toward the control room. You want someone who'll play it safe, hire a robot, but don't expect me to pretend that what I feel doesn't matter. He stepped toward the studio door, the light from the hallway spilled in warm golden, almost surreal. As he reached the doorway, he paused and turned back. I'd rather be a has-been who stood for something than a star who stood for nothing, and with that, he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, but somehow that soft click sounded louder than any slam. It echoed. It landed. In the control room, Harold Morrison sat pale, stunned. Even Colonel Parker, who always had something to say, was quiet. Bradley Winchester didn't laugh this time. He just sat there, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, like someone who had just seen something bigger than his paycheck could explain. For a long while, no one said a word, because what Elvis had done wasn't just bold, it was history. By the time Elvis reached the parking lot, the whispers had already started inside the studio. Someone had called another producer across town. A session guitarist texted a friend. Within an hour, the story was spreading like wildfire through the Nashville music scene. Elvis walked out. He refused to record their song. No, he gave a speech. Like a real one by nightfall, the phones at Rarca were ringing off the hook. Executives scrambled to do damage control. Meetings were called. Statements were drafted. Colonel Parker worked the phones like a man trying to put out a 5-alarm fire. But this wasn't just a PR crisis. This was a movement in the making. Because what none of them saw coming was the people. The story hit the press within days. To Rorke's horror, the public wasn't outraged at Elvis. They were inspired by him. Letters flooded, and not a trickle, but thousands from fans, songwriters, even fellow musicians. I heard what you said, and I've never respected you more. Thank you for standing up for the music. You reminded me why I started writing songs in the first place. And the young artists, oh, they paid attention. Studio musicians, underground bands, soul singers, folk poets. They saw Elvis's stand as a signal that maybe, just maybe, they could push back too. Inside the boardrooms, panic turned to confusion. The executives had thought Elvis was finished, that defying the system would destroy him, but the opposite happened. Eventually, with hesitation and plenty of arm twisting, Rada agreed to let Elvis record the album his way. No filters, no compromises. And when it dropped, it was unlike anything he had ever released. It's filled with raw emotion, truth, and spiritual weight. Tracks that didn't chase charts, they challenged them and the fans. They showed up big, the album sold, the singles climbed, critics praised it. But more importantly, something else happened. Elvis wasn't just a performer again, he was an artist again. And that walkout, that line, it didn't break his career, it revived it. Before you go, ask yourself something. What would you stand up for? Even if it cost you everything. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that staying true to your vision is always worth it, then don't just scroll away. Hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that authenticity will always outlive approval. Because in a world full of echoes, real voices still matter.